What if the most dangerous man in the mountains was not a hunter or an outlaw, but the doctor everyone trusted to heal them? Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment on where in the world you are watching from today. By the autumn of 1888, the settlement of Coldwater Holler lay so deep in the Appalachian folds of western North Carolina that it hardly felt like part of the same country as the towns below. It was the kind of place reached by mule path and memory, where roads became rutted tracks, and tracks became little more than instinct. In wet weather, the slopes turned slick and dangerous. In winter, the ridges closed in under snow and wind, and a sickbed could become a deathbed before help ever had a chance to arrive. People in Coldwater Holler were used to managing on their own because there had never been any real alternative. They splinted broken bones with shaved pine, brewed bitter remedies from roots and bark, and prayed over fevers with the same grim steadiness they brought to burying the dead. Women labored by lamplight, with only mothers, sisters, and neighbors to guide them. Men crushed fingers, split skin, and took infections into their blood because there was no physician near enough to matter. Illness was not unusual there. It was part of the landscape. That was the condition of the holler when Dr. Alistair Vail came up the mountain. He arrived in the last week of October, just before the first killing frost silvered the fields. Riding a tall chestnut gelding with two dark leather cases strapped behind the saddle and a wool greatcoat too fine for the rough country he had entered. He was a man perhaps in his early 40s, lean and erect, with a narrow face, pale, watchful eyes, and a beard trimmed so carefully that it seemed almost startling in a place where most men looked shaped by weather before they looked shaped by mirrors. He wore gloves of soft, dark leather, polished boots dulled only slightly by the climb, and small spectacles that gave him an air of study and precision before he ever said a word. Even his posture set him apart. He sat on a horse like a man accustomed to being observed and believed. He stopped first at the general store run by Abram Cutter and his wife Lenora, because in a place like Coldwater Holler every road, every rumor, and every stranger passed through that doorway sooner or later. By the time he dismounted, 2 boys had already sprinted off to tell their families, and 3 men had drifted close enough to listen without appearing to do so. A doctor. The word spread almost at once. A real doctor. Not a peddler of tonics, not a bone setter, not some half-drunk veteran with a field kit and a shaky hand, but an educated physician from Asheville or farther east, depending on who was doing the telling. Dr. Vail explained himself with remarkable calm. He said he had spent years in formal practice and had grown tired of towns where physicians competed with one another while mountain families went without any care at all. He spoke quietly, without swagger, and in that quiet there was something persuasive. He made no grand promises. He simply observed that settlements like this one had been left to endure too much pain alone, and that he believed his services might matter more here than they ever had elsewhere. It was exactly the right thing to say, not because it sounded clever, but because it sounded sincere. Within 48 hours he had been summoned to 3 homes. One was for a little girl burning with a chest fever that had already taken 2 children in a neighboring valley the year before. Another was for an elderly sawmill hand named Obie Rusk, whose leg had swollen black around a gash everyone had assumed would kill him. The third was for a young woman in hard labor, her face white with exhaustion, her mother already whispering prayers over her as though preparing for the worst. In each house, Dr. Vail entered with the same composed assurance. He washed his hands carefully. He opened his cases with deliberate order. He asked questions no one else thought to ask and listened with full attention when frightened relatives stumbled over details. He brought folded cloths, glass bottles, instruments wrapped with care, and, above all, a manner so steady that it quieted rooms before any medicine had even changed hands. The little girl survived the week. Obie Rusk's fever broke. The young woman delivered a living son just before dawn. In Coldwater Holler, that was enough. By Sunday morning, his name had passed from porch to porch, from cookfire to creek bank, and from one ridge cabin to the next. People spoke of him with a gratitude so sharp It almost sounded like disbelief. Some said Providence had finally remembered them. Others said no man traveled that far into the mountains unless the Lord had sent him there for a reason. Even those naturally suspicious of strangers found themselves surrendering to the plain fact that since his arrival, 3 families had been spared the kind of mourning that settled over a house for years. And that was how he entered their lives. Not with scandal. Not with any visible sign of darkness. He came as a relief. As the man with the black bag and the measured voice. As the educated stranger who knew what to do when blood would not stop. When a child could not breathe. When a mother's strength began to fail. In a place where sickness had always outrun help, Dr. Alistair Vale did not have to earn trust slowly. The holler gave it to him almost at once, because hope had been scarce there for too long. And people are often most vulnerable not when they are afraid, but when they finally believe they no longer need to be. In the months that followed Dr. Alistair Vale's arrival, Coldwater Holler began to reorganize itself around him in ways no one would have thought possible a season earlier. Before he came, illness in the settlement had been treated as a private burden, something each family endured within the walls of its own cabin until the patient recovered or failed to recover. There was no hospital within practical reach, no carriage road fit for urgent travel, no physician a rider could fetch and return with before a fever turned dangerous or a wound began to rot. If a child's breathing turned shallow in the night, the family lit lamps and prayed. If a man split his leg with an axe or crushed a hand beneath wagon iron, his wife packed the injury with whatever poultice the older women recommended and hoped corruption did not set in. Childbirth was its own world of danger. Women vanished behind closed doors for long hours or whole nights, while husbands stood outside in helpless silence, listening for the first cry of a baby and fearing the silence that might follow instead. Dr. Vale changed that almost at once. People began sending for him at all hours, no matter the weather or distance. He would come through sleet with his lantern swinging low, or ride narrow ridge paths in freezing dawnlight with frost on his coat collar, or leave his supper untouched because some boy had arrived breathless at his door, saying a woman on Laurel Branch was bleeding badly after childbirth, or old Mr. Caskey had taken a fall and could not be woken. He never complained. That, more than anything, made an impression. He seemed to move through suffering with the calm of a man entering familiar rooms. He knew how to set bones cleanly. He lanced infections others would have left to poison the blood. He soothed colicking infants, stitched torn flesh, reduced fevers, and did things with herbs, tinctures, powders, and measured doses from his glass bottles that looked to mountain people like the difference between knowledge and magic. By the middle of winter, even the settlement's hardest men had begun speaking his name with something close to reverence. Reverend Asa Tiller, who had first regarded him with the reserved caution he showed all outsiders, now quoted him openly when speaking of the body as one of the Lord's frail instruments. The Holland family, who owned more bottomland than anyone else in the holler and were not accustomed to deferring to men they had not known since childhood, began consulting Dr. Vale on matters that had little to do with illness at all. He was asked to mediate worries, to assess whether an elderly parent still had strength for another winter, to advise whether a daughter with spells and weakness ought to be married young or kept close to home. People trusted him not simply because he healed, but because he carried himself as if certainty were a form of mercy, and perhaps, at first, it was. Still, there were small things that lingered at the edge of notice. Patients he treated often survived when others feared they would not, but some did not return to themselves as cleanly as people expected. A woman whose birthing fever he brought down became so listless afterward that she no longer sang while hanging wash, though she had once been known for it. An injured sawyer whose shattered shoulder Dr. Vale dressed and bandaged properly enough began asking for the doctor's drops long after the pain should have eased, saying he could not sleep without them and could barely think when they ran out. A little boy, saved from a terrible lung sickness, grew pale and strangely quiet, clinging to his mother's skirt and staring at corners of rooms as if listening for something no one else could hear. None of these things, taken alone, seemed enough to question. Mountain illness left marks. Hard recoveries changed people. Everyone knew that. And when a man is the reason your child still breathes, or your wife did not die in childbirth, or your father has one more winter by the fire, you do not rush to examine the shadows at the edge of his help. You tell yourself weakness is the price of survival. You tell yourself dependence is natural after suffering. You tell yourself gratitude matters more than doubt. That was how Dr. Vale became indispensable to Coldwater Holler. Not all at once, and not by force, but by making himself the answer to pain in a place where pain had always gone unanswered. By the time the first deep snows sealed the higher trails, there was scarcely a family in the settlement that had not opened its door to him in fear, and watched him leave, with their relief following close behind. And once a man has become necessary in a place like that, people stop asking whether every part of his help is truly help. They begin instead to fear what would happen if he were ever not there. By the time the worst of winter loosened its grip on Coldwater Holler, there were already stories moving quietly through the settlement that no one was yet willing to call warnings. They traveled the way troubling things usually do in small mountain places, not as open accusations but as hesitations in conversation, as lowered voices between women shelling beans on a porch, and as a man staring too long into the stove before admitting that his brother had not been right since the fever broke. Nobody said Dr. Alistair Vale had done harm, not directly. It was still far easier, and safer feeling, to say only that some recoveries seemed stranger than they ought to have been. At first, the pattern was easy to dismiss because each case had its own explanation. Temperance Voss, a strong woman of 31, who had survived a difficult childbirth in December, had once been known for speaking quickly, laughing easily, and managing her household with the sort of restless energy people noticed even when they took it for granted. After Dr. Vale brought her through the birthing fever that everyone expected would kill her, she lived. And that alone was enough to make her husband speak of the man with near religious gratitude. But by February, neighbors had begun remarking, carefully and only to one another, that Temperance seemed dimmed. She moved more slowly. She forgot things in the middle of doing them. She would stand at the washtub with her hands in cold water, staring not at the laundry but past it, as though some thread of thought had gone loose inside her and never been tied back again. Then there was Jeb Hollis, who had taken an axe wound high in the thigh while cutting timber above the creek. Before the injury he had been broad-shouldered and full of rough good humor, the kind of man who sang under his breath while working and could split a wagon tongue without stopping to wipe his brow. Dr. Vale cleaned the wound, stitched it, and gave him a bitter liquid for the pain, along with powders meant to ease inflammation and help him sleep. The leg healed, at least outwardly. Jeb kept it. He walked again. Yet by spring planting he had become a thinner, paler version of himself, easily winded, quick to tremble, and so dependent on the doctor's draughts that his wife had to send their youngest boy for refills twice in 1 month. If the bottle ran low, Jeb grew agitated in a way no one had seen before, rubbing his hands together, speaking sharply, then apologizing with tears in his eyes as if he did not understand his own temper. Others followed. A child was saved from lung fever but left ghost quiet and fearful of dark corners. An elderly widow whose swelling in the chest improved for a time under Dr. Vale's care, only for her to become unnaturally sleepy, nodding off in daylight with her spoon still in hand. A young mother whose infection passed, but who afterward seemed unable to bear noise, light, or even the sound of her own children playing near the hearth. In every case, survival had been purchased, and for that reason no family wanted to sound ungrateful. The mountain had long taught them that living through an illness was victory enough. Still, there was a difference between weakness after suffering and the peculiar thinning people began to notice in those Dr. Vale treated longest. It was not simply that they were frail. It was that some private center of them seemed to have been pressed down or drained away. The families spoke of it in careful, almost ashamed language. They said a person had not quite come back. They said he was alive, praising God, but not himself. They said she had been spared, yes, though something in her had gone distant. No one wanted those remarks repeated beyond trusted kitchens and backsteps, because saying them too openly felt close to accusing the very man who had prevented funerals. And yet repetition has a power of its own. One odd recovery can be explained, two can be ignored. But when the same uneasy note begins sounding from cabin to cabin across a holler, people hear it even when they pretend not to. There were also the medicines themselves, though few had knowledge enough to question them properly. Dr. Vale's dark bottles and folded powders came labeled in a neat hand no one else in Coldwater Holler could fully decipher. He instructed patients carefully, sometimes with great insistence, and often required that only he adjust the dosage. If a person worsened, he would say the body was resisting treatment and needed time. If a patient became listless or confused, he spoke of exhaustion, inflammation, or the strain of near death. These were reasonable explanations, and he offered them in such a composed tone that most people accepted them because they did not possess words stronger than his. But acceptance did not erase unease. It only drove it inward, where it began taking root. By early March, there were families in Coldwater Holler who had started doing something they never would have admitted in daylight. Before giving a sick relative another spoonful from one of Dr. Vale's bottles, they hesitated. Not long, not enough to refuse, just a pause, just the smallest tightening in the chest, the kind that comes when gratitude and dread begin, for the first time, to sit at the same table. As the spring rains settled over Coldwater Holler and turned the paths between cabins into slick ribbons of mud, Dr. Alistair Vale's presence in the settlement became stranger in ways that were difficult to name without sounding ungrateful. By then, no one questioned his right to come and go at nearly any hour. He had earned too much trust too quickly for that. If his horse appeared on a ridge after midnight, or his lantern was seen moving between trees long after decent people had banked their fires and gone to bed, the first assumption was always that someone must be in need. In a place where sickness could turn fatal between sundown and dawn, no one wanted to be the person who resented a doctor for answering a knock in the dark. Still, people noticed patterns. His late visits were not evenly spread through the holler. Certain homes saw him more often than others, especially houses where grief had recently entered or where money had always been scarce enough to make refusal feel dangerous. He went often to the Bledsoe cabin after Miriam Bledsoe lost her husband beneath a toppled chestnut and was left with 3 children and a cough that never seemed to leave her chest. He called repeatedly on old Willa Fane, whose swollen joints and failing lungs had made her dependent on his tonics just to cross a room without sitting down to gasp. He took particular interest in the Rutter place after their youngest daughter suffered a winter fever and survived in that altered, quiet way some children now seemed to survive under his care. Families told themselves this was simply diligence. A good physician followed difficult cases closely. That was what a blessing looked like in practical form. But there were details that sat wrong once noticed. Dr. Vale did not always leave when the treatment was done. Sometimes he remained at a bedside longer than seemed necessary, asking questions in his low, measured voice while a patient drifted in and out beneath the effects of his medicines. He asked not only about pain, appetite, fever, and sleep, but also about dreams, fears, moods, private thoughts, and memories. He asked grieving widows whether loneliness made the body feel heavier in certain hours of the night. He asked mothers whether their recovering children woke, speaking strangely, or stared at walls as if listening. He asked injured men whether the medicines softened only their pain or changed the sharpness of their anger, their hunger, or even their sense of time. These were not the sort of questions mountain people expected from a country doctor. They sounded less like treatment and more like inquiry. Then there were his notes. Nearly everyone in Coldwater Holler had seen him write, but only in glimpses. A slim leather book opened on a kitchen table, his neat hand moving steadily while a lamp hissed nearby. Folded sheets tucked back into his case with a care that suggested great importance. At first this, too, was interpreted as professionalism. An educated man kept records. That only proved he knew his trade. Yet some who watched him closely began to suspect he was recording more than symptoms and remedies. He wrote down how long a woman cried after speaking of her dead husband. He marked the exact hour a fevered child stopped resisting the spoon and accepted medicine without complaint. He noted how an elderly man's speech slowed over the course of several visits, how often a patient startled at a sudden sound, and how quickly dependence formed when certain drops were withheld and then restored. Rumors spread in the way they always did there, half-whispered and immediately softened by excuses. Prudence became caution. Curiosity became overthinking. People said perhaps educated medicine required attention to finer details than mountain folk understood. Perhaps his questions, odd as they seemed, were the reason he was able to save people others would have buried. Perhaps his lingering after dark only meant he took his duties more seriously than any man they had known before. And beneath all of that reasoning sat the truth no one wanted to touch directly. They were afraid to offend him, afraid to challenge him, afraid that if suspicion ever reached his ears and pride drove him away, Coldwater Holler would be left once more to face childbirth, infection, and winter sickness with nothing but old poultices, prayer, and luck. So they swallowed what unsettled them. They accepted the sight of his lantern outside poor cabins at midnight. They accepted the way certain families had come to rely on him so completely that they would not change a dose or miss a visit without his permission. They accepted, too, the uneasy feeling that his interest in some patients ran deeper than care alone. By early summer, a person could stand outside on a warm night and see, far off through the trees, the faint movement of Dr. Vale's lantern making its way toward another isolated house, and in more than one home across the holler, that sight no longer brought uncomplicated relief. It brought relief first, yes, but with something colder beneath it, something people still refused to name because naming it would mean deciding whether to act. And no one in Coldwater Holler yet felt ready to risk losing the only doctor who had ever climbed the mountain and stayed. The first person in Coldwater Holler to look at Dr. Alistair Vale not as a blessing, nor even as a danger, but as a pattern, was a woman most people had long ago stopped thinking of as central to anything. Her name was Elspeth Kinnear, and by the summer of 1889, she had lived enough life in the mountains to become nearly invisible in the particular way capable women often do. She was 36 years old, widowed for almost 5 years, and had taken over the small schoolhouse after her husband's death because reading, figures, and orderly handwriting came more naturally to her than grief ever had. She taught children their letters in the morning, kept a small garden behind her cabin, and in the evenings copied passages from borrowed books by lamplight to save herself the cost of owning them. Men in the holler regarded her with a kind of respectful vagueness. They called her sensible, useful, quiet, which, in practice, meant they rarely imagined she might be noticing more than they were. But Elspeth noticed nearly everything. Because she taught children from all over the settlement, she heard family troubles in fragments before anyone meant them to become known. A boy would mention that his mother slept half the day now because the doctor said rest was part of healing. A girl would say her grandfather no longer remembered what season it was, though he had been sharp as a tack before the winter sickness. Another child, distracted at her slate, would confess that Dr. Vale had come again after midnight, and that her father hated when he stayed to write in his little black book because nobody could sleep while he was there. These remarks were small on their own, the kind of domestic details adults disregard because they are buried in the clutter of ordinary hardship. But Elspeth had the kind of mind that held such details in place instead of letting them drift away. She also had access to things the men did not think to compare. Since she was one of the few people in Coldwater Holler who wrote a clear hand, neighbors often asked her to help with correspondence. She penned letters to relatives in lower counties, copied requests to merchants, and read replies aloud for families who trusted her discretion. When Dr. Vale began ordering supplies from farther east, through traders and apothecaries, some of those receipts and letters passed briefly through hands like hers. either because Abram Cutter at the store needed help deciphering a shipment notice, or because Dr. Vale himself, occupied elsewhere, asked for a copied inventory when his own notes had become crowded. Elspeth never went looking for secrets. The mountain simply had a way of placing information before the person was patient enough to recognize its shape. What first troubled her was not a single dramatic revelation, but the way certain names began recurring across unrelated things. Temperance Voss, whose recovery never seemed complete, appeared in conversation with one mother and then again in a request for more sleeping draught. Jeb Hollis, who could no longer manage a full day's work without trembling, was mentioned in connection with a delayed payment because Dr. Vale had continued extending medicine on credit. Miriam Bledsoe's children were said to be falling behind in school because their mother now spent long hours in bed after one of the doctor's nighttime visits. A shipment list arriving through the store included larger quantities of laudanum, chloral hydrate, and tinctures. Elspeth recognized it only because an old medical handbook left behind by a circuit teacher described their strongest effects in careful, clinical language. There was more of it than she would have expected for one small holler full of ordinary mountain ailments. Then there were the disappearances from ordinary life, which were not the same as death and somehow felt stranger for that. People were not vanishing into the forest, they were vanishing from themselves. A mother stopped attending church. A once capable man no longer kept up his field. An elderly woman who had always sat in a front window shelling peas seemed to spend entire afternoons asleep in her chair. These things were explained away one by one, yet taken together they suggested something Elspeth could no longer dismiss. Dr. Vale's patients did not simply recover slowly. Some of them entered a second condition after surviving, one marked by dependence, confusion, exhaustion, and a peculiar yielding of will. She began, very quietly, to ask questions no one else thought to ask in sequence. When had the weakness started, before or after the second bottle? How often had the doctor returned once the fever was already gone? Did he change the medicine when the patient seemed to improve or increase it? Had he asked unusual questions while writing in his ledger? Families answered cautiously at first, because gratitude still outweighed suspicion, but women, in particular, told her more than they realized once she framed her concern as practical curiosity. They admitted he had asked about dreams, moods, fears, and thoughts. They admitted he sometimes preferred to speak to a patient alone. They admitted that when they tried withholding his powders or drops, the patient often worsened so sharply they lost their nerve and resumed them. Elspeth said very little in response. That was part of what made people keep talking. She did not sound hysterical or eager for scandal. She sounded thoughtful, grave. She listened, then thanked them, then moved on to the next small fact. By late July, she had reached a conclusion she did not yet dare speak aloud, not even to Reverend Tiller, whose judgment she usually trusted. She no longer believed Dr. Vale was merely making mistakes or relying too heavily on strong medicines. Mistakes were uneven. This was too consistent, too careful, too tailored to the vulnerable. He was not simply treating pain and misjudging the aftermath. He was observing what his treatments did to people and returning to adjust them, not despite the damage, but because of it. That possibility sat inside her mind with a coldness that seemed to lower the room around her whenever she let herself fully feel it. And once she saw the pattern, she could not stop seeing it. Every nighttime visit, every weakened patient, every repeated order, every neat page of notes became part of the same dark design. The doctor had not just made himself necessary to Coldwater Holler. He had begun, patient by patient, to turn certain lives into something he could study, shape, and keep. Elspeth Kinnear did not set out to become an investigator in any formal sense, because there was no formal sense for such things in Coldwater Holler. There was no sheriff nearby who would ride for suspicion alone, no magistrate waiting below the ridge with patience for a widow's unease and a bundle of half-connected observations. There was only a growing conviction that if she did not look more closely, whatever Dr. Alistair Vale was doing would continue unchecked until the Holler no longer remembered what ordinary suffering had once looked like. Even then, she moved carefully. A careless accusation would not merely fail. It would drive the man away or warn him to hide what he had already hidden so well. The opportunity came in late August when Dr. Vale was called before dawn to a logging camp 2 ridges over, where a saw had come loose and torn open a man's side. He left in haste, taking only one of his leather cases, and telling Abram Cutter at the store that he might be gone until after nightfall. Elspeth heard this not because she was spying, but because she had come to collect copybooks for the school children and had developed the habit of listening whenever the doctor's movements were mentioned. She also knew, from scattered remarks over prior months, that Vale sometimes used the rear room of his rented house above the store to compound medicines when he wanted privacy, and that he kept a small outbuilding behind it secured with a lock he never entrusted to anyone. She waited until midday, when the holler settled into that brief hush between labor and supper preparations, and then went to see Lenora Cutter under the pretense of returning a borrowed shawl. Lenora, tired and distracted, spoke more freely than usual. She admitted that Dr. Vale had forbidden anyone from entering the rear room after a breakage some weeks earlier, claiming that certain medical substances inside were dangerous if mishandled. She also said, with visible discomfort, that the doctor had grown very particular about his ledger books and had twice asked whether anyone had touched his desk. It was the sort of unnecessary defensiveness that, once heard by the right mind, clarified rather than concealed. Elspeth asked for nothing openly. She waited until Lenora stepped away to check a pot on the stove, then moved through the narrow hall with the quiet decisiveness of someone who had already accepted the moral cost of what she was doing. The rear room door was locked, but old mountain houses were built by practical hands, not craftsmen guarding secrets forever. The latch plate had loosened slightly from repeated use. With a thin table knife and a steadier hand than she knew she possessed, she worked it back just far enough for the door to give. The smell reached her before the room fully opened. Not the ordinary sharpness of alcohol or the sourness of common medicinal compounds, but something denser and stranger, layered with preservative spirits, old blood, camphor, damp paper, and a sweetness beneath it that turned her stomach the more she tried not to identify it. The room itself was orderly in the most unsettling way. Shelves lined the walls, and on them stood rows of glass jars, each labeled in the doctor's careful hand. Some contained dried roots and powders she could not name. Others held preserved tissues, discolored fluids, and specimens whose nature she understood only enough to wish she did not. A narrow work table stood under the window, laid out not like a simple physician's station, but like something between a laboratory and a butcher's preparation bench. There were metal instruments, far finer and more numerous than any country doctor should have required. Scalpels of varying size, bone saws, clamps, syringes, probes, forceps, and delicate hooks, arranged with almost devotional neatness on folded cloth. But it was the papers that changed everything. There were patient notes. Yes, though not in the form she had expected, they did not read like a healer's effort to relieve pain. They read like observations made from a distance, as if each suffering person in Coldwater Holler had become a problem to be measured rather than a soul to be helped. Names she knew filled the pages: Temperance Voss, Jeb Hollis, Miriam Bledsoe, Willa Fain. Beside them were not only doses and dates, but also entries on response to sedation, duration of cognitive blunting, dependency formation after withdrawal, compliance improved following bereavement, and notable decrease in self-assertion after repeated administration. One line, written with chilling calm beside the name of a child, noted that night terrors had increased following a change in tincture, but that maternal attachment now exceeds former baseline, and separation distress may provide useful continuation conditions. Elspeth stood perfectly still as she read, not because she was calm, but because terror had frozen her into a kind of unnatural clarity. This was no clumsy overmedication by an arrogant physician, no unfortunate pattern of side effects. Dr. Vale knew exactly what his mixtures were doing, More than that, he was refining them, adjusting them, recording outcomes the way a naturalist might note how frost altered plants in different soil. Pain, grief, confusion, dependence, docility, agitation under withdrawal, increased suggestibility during recovery, none of it was incidental. That was the point. Then she found the ledger. It lay in a locked drawer she almost failed to notice because its face had been built flush into the desk, visible only from an angle. The key was not in the room, but the wood around the mechanism had already split slightly with age, and panic gave her the force to pry it enough to slip the drawer. Inside was a thick, leather-bound volume with no title on the cover. She opened it, expecting a physician's account book. What she found was something colder. Each entry treated a patient not as a person, but as a long-term trial. There were categories. Subjects were grouped by age, condition, social standing, emotional vulnerability, and external interference risk. Notes recorded how poverty increased compliance, how widowed patients tolerated stronger preparations with less initial resistance, and how children recovering from fever could be made more submissive if the mother's sleep was first weakened by separate treatment. He had even marked which families were least likely to question prolonged care because they believed themselves indebted to him for an earlier rescue. There was no rage in the handwriting. That was what made it unbearable. A madman's scrawl might have offered comfort of a sort. This was worse. The lines were clean, even elegant. The mind behind them was patient, educated, and entirely aware of what it was doing. By the time Elspeth heard Lenora moving in the front of the house again, she understood that Coldwater Holler was facing something much darker than a doctor with strange habits. Alistair Vale had built himself a private science out of weakness. He had looked at isolation, grief, illness, and trust, and seen not burdens to relieve but ideal conditions for experiment. The people of the Holler were not simply under his care, they were material to him. Cases, subjects, lives small enough in the eyes of the world that he believed he could shape them, diminish them, and document the results without ever being meaningfully challenged. When Elspeth slipped back into the hall and closed the door behind her, the entire settlement felt changed. The mountain air outside was the same, the afternoon light still lay over the ridge the same way it always had, and somewhere a child was laughing near the creek, yet none of it looked innocent anymore. She had crossed a line from suspicion into knowledge, and knowledge carried its own kind of dread. Whatever happened next, whatever proof she might gather or fail to gather, she could no longer tell herself Dr. Vale was merely unsettling. He was deliberate, he was disciplined, and he was far more dangerous than anyone in Coldwater Holler had imagined. Once Elspeth Kinnear had seen the ledger, she could no longer think of Dr. Alistair Vale's work in the abstract. The horror of it ceased to be a matter of troubling patterns and became something far more intimate and far more difficult to bear. What she had uncovered was not the cruelty of a man lashing out blindly at whoever crossed his path. It was worse than that. It was selective. It was disciplined. It was built around the people least able to refuse him and least likely to be defended if something about his care went wrong. That was what made the truth feel so morally unbearable. He had not chosen the strongest households. In the Holler, not the men with means enough to fetch help from outside or the families whose names carried weight in county matters. He had centered himself instead in the lives of those already cornered by circumstance. Women in childbirth, too weak from blood loss and terror to question what was put between their lips. Mothers were recovering from fever, frightened enough for their children that they would have swallowed anything he called necessary. Laborers split open by saws or crushed under timber, desperate for relief from pain so intense it stripped them of judgment. Elderly people whose sons and daughters were worn thin from tending them and would accept any medicine that promised one more month, one more winter, one more chance to keep the grave at a distance. And children, especially children, burning with fevers their families did not understand, their small bodies thrown helplessly into the hands of the only educated man for miles. Coldwater Holler had mistaken this concentration of suffering for virtue. They had said, Dr. Vale had a special heart for the poor, for the difficult cases, for those others would have written off. They had praised his patience with frailty. They had marveled at the way he could sit all night beside a child's bed, or ride through freezing rain to attend a woman laboring in a drafty cabin where the windows had been stuffed with old quilts against the wind. They thought his willingness to go where pain was worst proved something noble in him. But Elspeth knew now that he had gone there because dependence was deepest there. In his ledger the language never cracked. That, perhaps, was the darkest part. He did not write like a fiend or a butcher, he wrote like a scholar. He referred to terror as heightened suggestibility. He referred to grief as compliance conditions improved by bereavement. He referred to the weakening of a mother's will as successful reduction, of agitation under sustained tonic administration. Even children were not described in terms of innocence or suffering, but as responsive subjects whose fevers, fears, and attachment to caregivers created ideal circumstances for prolonged observation. The words themselves were clinical, almost elegant, and that elegance concealed the obscenity of what he was actually doing. He had taken the language of mercy and made it a covering for domination. There were examples all through the holler once one knew how to see them. Miriam Bledsoe, worn down by widowhood, coughing blood into handkerchiefs she hid from her children, had accepted every draft he gave her, because he told her strength of mind affected strength of body, and because she could not bear the thought of leaving her children motherless. But his treatments did not restore her. They quieted her. They left her drowsier with each passing week, less able to manage her home, less able even to decide whether she wanted another bottle, until the children themselves had begun speaking of the doctor as though he were part of the household's natural order. Temperance Voss had survived childbirth only to become a pale witness to her own life, moving through rooms with a softness that looked from a distance like recovery, but up close resembled surrender. Jeb Hollis, whose leg had been saved, now lived between pain and the doctor's relief from pain, unable to work steadily, unable to refuse the very medicine that had hollowed him out. And then there were the elderly. Willa Fane, old and widowed, whose breathing had become shallow and uncertain long before Vale came. Her family had thanked God for him when he first eased the fluid in her chest and gave her nights of sleep she had not known in months. But sleep became stupor. Relief became absence. She remained alive, technically. Yet her daughter confided to Elspeth one evening that it sometimes felt as though the doctor had not saved her mother so much as placed her at a distance from herself, where she could no longer fully return. The children were worse. Because children strip away the last excuses adults try to make for evil. A child does not choose dependence. A child does not understand informed consent or medical necessity or the hierarchy of knowledge between expert and parent. A child trusts because the adults around them trust. In Coldwater Holler, that trust had become a doorway Dr. Vale walked through again and again. He soothed frightened mothers, lowered fevers, stopped convulsions, eased breathing, and, for that reason, families opened everything to him, their homes, their schedules, their worries, and the private rhythms of who woke in the night, and who cried when separated, and who became pliant under certain doses. What he recorded was not simply survival. It was how suffering changed behavior, how fear made obedience easier, how prolonged weakness could remake an entire household around the one person claiming to hold the cure. That was the true shape of his evil. He did not need to kill freely to be monstrous. He only needed to understand that in a place like Coldwater Holler, medicine gave him access to the most defenseless moments in a human life: birth, fever, injury, grief, age. He stood at those thresholds, carrying bottles, instruments, and educated words, and the people who let him in did so because not letting him in would have felt like condemning someone they loved. By the time Elspeth began quietly preparing to tell others what she knew, she understood that this was not merely a story about a doctor who had gone wrong. It was a story about how absolute need can be turned into a hunting ground by the wrong kind of man. Vale had hidden not behind force, but behind care itself. He had wrapped cruelty in bedside manner, arranged it neatly beside folded cloths and polished instruments, and spoken over it in the language of science until whole families mistook their growing ruin for healing. And that was why the holler would struggle to face the truth even once it was laid before them. To admit what Dr. Vale was meant to do was to admit something even more painful, that some of their most sacred acts of trust had not only been misplaced, but also used against them. Elspeth Kinnear did not bring what she had found to the whole holler at once, because she understood too well how truth can fail when it arrives faster than people are able to bear it. Instead, she began with Reverend Asa Tiller, then Abram and Lenora Cutter, and finally Harlan Voss, who, for all his bluntness, was still one of the few men in Coldwater Holler. Others would follow if the matter turned grave. She showed them the copied fragments she had managed to preserve from the ledger, along with the supply lists and notes she had quietly set beside them over the past weeks. At first, even then, there was resistance, not because the evidence was weak, but because accepting it meant tearing through the last protection people had built around themselves. A cruel stranger can be opposed. A healer into whose hands you have already placed your wife, your children, your old parents, and your own pain is much harder to think about clearly. In the end, what moved them was not outrage, but dread. They chose a night when Dr. Alistair Vale had ridden to a distant ridge cabin where a mill hand's wife had gone into difficult labor. Harlan, Reverend Tiller, Abram Cutter, and two others approached the property in silence, with Elspeth following at a distance she had argued for and then refused to keep. The house above the store stood dark except for one low lamp left burning in the front room. Nothing in its outward appearance suggested the kind of place where evil might root itself so deliberately. That, perhaps, was part of the insult. It looked orderly, respectable, merely rented. The rear room yielded, as Elspeth had said it would, though Harlan's jaw tightened visibly the moment the smell reached them. Reverend Tiller, who had buried children and sat through winter fevers and thought himself acquainted with human suffering, removed his hat and held it against his chest as he stepped inside, as if some old instinct had told him they were entering a chamber where ordinary posture no longer applied. The shelves, the jars, the folded instruments, the labels written in that composed hand, all of it was as Elspeth had described, yet somehow worse when seen together by men who had once admired the discipline it represented. There is something especially dreadful about realizing that intelligence has not merely accompanied cruelty, but strengthened it. Still, the rear room was only the threshold. What they had come for lay beneath. Abram remembered then what he had dismissed months earlier as nothing more than practical medicine. Vale had once paid extra to have a trapdoor reinforced beneath the back flooring, claiming he needed cooler storage for certain compounds that heat might spoil. At the time it had seemed sensible. Now Harlan found the edge of the square seam under a rug and pried it up with the iron tip of the stove poker. Beneath was a narrow wooden stair dropping into darkness so complete that for a moment no one moved. Then Reverend Tiller lit a second lantern, and the five of them went down. The cellar was not large, but it had been made efficient in the manner of a mind that valued process over comfort. Shelves had been built into the earth-packed walls. A long central table stood under hooks from which lamps or tools could be hung. Locked cabinets lined one side, and on the other were crates of supplies arranged by category and date. Nothing was haphazard. Nothing suggested panic or improvisation. That was what made the space so dreadful before they had even opened a drawer. It had not been made for concealment alone. It had been made for continuation. There were records everywhere. Not loose scribblings or a few hidden notes, but years of careful documentation bundled with ribbon, stacked in sequence, indexed by family name, condition, and what Vale called response class. Children's fevers, postpartum recoveries, chronic pain, elder decline, grief reactions following bereavement. Each category was subdivided, compared, and annotated with a patience that stripped the soul from what it described. A woman recovering from childbirth was not written off as someone's daughter or wife or mother. She was a subject under prolonged observation during a compliance window. An injured laborer was a male response case for dependency thresholds. A coughing widow became an ideal solitary regimen condition due to reduced household resistance. Alongside the records were dosage tables, revisions, failed combinations, and remarks on how particular mixtures affected memory, passivity, sleep, appetite, fear, and suggestibility. There were instruments too, and though none of the men present were physicians, all understood that what they saw exceeded country medicine by a wide and unnatural margin. Syringes of unusual size and delicacy, fine cutting tools, restraint straps folded and stacked as neatly as church linens, measuring devices for pulse, pressure, and pupil response. Scales meant not for household use but for minute quantities, not crude tools of violence, but precise tools of control. Their horror came not from bloodshed, but from intention, from the fact that each object belonged to a system. Each had its place in a routine repeated enough times to require storage, maintenance, and record-keeping. In one cabinet they found labeled bottles prepared in batches, some corresponding not to named patients but to types: bereaved female, adolescent fever, prolonged pain male, and geriatric breathing distress. Harlan stared at those labels a long time before saying anything. When he did speak, it was only to ask, in a voice gone flat, how many times a man had to do such a thing before he stopped seeing the people before him as people at all. No one answered, because the cellar itself had already answered. What they did not find was almost as damning as what they did. There was no sign of shame, no hidden plea, no frenzied confession, no disordered evidence of a conscience losing its battle with obsession. Vale had not descended into this work in madness. He had organized it, improved it, protected it with calm foresight. Even the way patient records were cross-referenced against household means, family structure, and likelihood of complaint revealed a mind studying not only the body, but also the social weakness surrounding it. He had not merely abused trust, he had mapped it. Reverend Tiller was the one who found the final ledger tucked inside a locked metal box beneath the table. Unlike the others, this volume was not written as a physician's journal at all. It was closer to a statement of belief. In it, Vale wrote of mountain isolation as ideal medical territory, of rural ignorance as an obstacle outwardly, an advantage privately, and of dependency as the purest demonstration of therapeutic authority. He wrote that proper science required conditions uncontaminated by outside scrutiny, and that the poor, the frail, and the grief-stricken offered the clearest access to unguarded response. The language remained polished throughout, which only deepened the obscenity of it. He was not hiding behind care by accident. He had chosen care because it granted him entry into the most undefended corners of human life. By the time they climbed back up into the night air, Coldwater Holler had changed forever, whether the rest of the settlement knew it yet or not. The truth beneath the practice was no single atrocity that could be pointed to and quickly condemned. It was a whole architecture of betrayal, built patiently under the cover of service and maintained with the discipline people had mistaken for virtue. For months, perhaps years, the town had thanked this man for coming when called, for sitting beside the sick, for speaking gently to mothers and old people and frightened children. All the while he had been turning their trust into a private order of study, refining suffering into data, and using the language of mercy to disguise what was, at its core, the coldest kind of domination. When Elspeth looked back at the house from the yard, she felt no satisfaction at having been right, only a vast and sorrowful nausea. Because now the Holler knew, and knowing meant they would have to face not just what Dr. Vale had done, but how completely he had been welcomed while doing it. They meant to take Dr. Alistair Vale before dawn. That had been the plan agreed upon in Reverend Tiller's parlor after the cellar was searched and the ledgers brought out into the lamplight, like things too corrupt to be left underground another hour. Harlan Voss wanted to go that same night, rifle in hand, but the others argued for care. Vale was armed, intelligent, and accustomed to thinking ahead. If they rushed him blindly, he might slip them in the dark, or turn the confrontation bloody before the fellow understood what was happening. So they settled on first light. They would gather 6 men, ride to the distant cabin where he had gone on the labor call, confront him together, and bring him back alive if they could. It was the closest thing to order the settlement could still imagine, but sometime before morning, order failed them. Those who lived nearest the store woke first to the smell of smoke. Not the warm domestic smell of oak in a stove, but a sharper, faster burning smoke that sends people from bed half-dressed before their minds have caught up. By the time Abram Cutter reached the yard, flames were already pushing out through the rear windows of the doctor's rented house, bright and violent against the last blue hour before dawn. Men formed a line from the pump. Women shouted for blankets and buckets. Someone ran for Reverend Tiller. Someone else yelled that the back of the house had gone up too quickly to be accidental. They got the fire under control before it could take the store with it. But not before the rear room was blackened and half collapsed, and the trapdoor to the cellar had fallen beneath charred boards. Much of what they had seen hours earlier was destroyed. Shelves had come down. Papers burned where they lay. Bottles burst in the heat. Instruments were found warped and blackened among the ash. Some records survived only because Elspeth and the others had already removed them, but enough was lost to make the devastation feel deliberate in a way no one there could ignore. Vale himself was nowhere on the property, nor was his horse. That detail settled over the crowd with a silence deeper than the fire had left behind. He had known. Whether someone warned him, or whether he returned in the night and sensed the change in the house, or whether he had simply always prepared for this possibility, no one could say. What mattered was that he had not been caught inside the burning ruin. He had chosen the moment of his disappearance and, in doing so, had denied the holler the one thing it most desperately wanted: the sight of him standing before them as a man, answerable at last for what he had done. They followed what trail they could after sunrise. Harlan, Ephraim Dace, Reverend Tiller's nephew Cal, and 3 others rode west along the ridge road, where hoof marks showed fresh passage through wet ground. The tracks led them into higher country, then into stony terrain, where the mountains stopped keeping clear accounts. Near a narrow gap above Blackthorn Branch, they found one of Vale's leather cases split open beside a rock shelf, several glass vials shattered around it, and loose pages from a ledger blown into laurel roots by the wind. A few yards farther on, they discovered a second sign that he had passed in haste: a medical roll abandoned in the brush, missing half its contents, as though he had paused just long enough to discard weight before pushing deeper into the hills. And then, as so often happens in mountain country, the land closed over the rest. No man among them knew those upper cuts and ravines as well as a determined fugitive might learn them in a single desperate ride. Rain came before noon and broke what little trace remained. By evening, they had found nothing more. Not the doctor, not the horse, not a campfire, not a body pitched into some hidden drop. Just absence. Just wet stone, dark timber, and the maddening certainty that he had passed through their reach by a margin too narrow to bear. He was never taken. That was the wound beneath all the others. Coldwater Holler got truth, yes, or enough of it to poison whatever innocence had remained there. They had the ledgers pulled from the cellar, the labels, the copied pages in Elspeth's careful hand, and the testimonies of families who now understood too late what had been done in the name of treatment. But truth without capture is its own torment. It leaves the mind circling. It offers no final scene sturdy enough to stand on. There was no trial, no confession, no moment in which the community could look at Alistair Vale and force him, even briefly, to exist under the weight of their knowledge. Instead, there was only the burned house, the missing records, and the western mountains swallowing one more man who had learned how useful isolation could be. For weeks afterward, people woke at small sounds in the dark, certain they had heard a horse on the ridge or a careful step outside the door. Mothers checked windows twice before sleeping. Old patients asked in frightened whispers whether the doctor was coming back. No one could answer them honestly, because the hardest part was not merely that he had escaped. It was that he had escaped in exactly the way a man like him always hoped to, leaving behind enough evidence to ruin peace, but not enough closure to restore it. That is why the people who remembered him, and the few who passed the story down after them, came to think of him as the Appalachian doctor too evil for the history books. Not because the holler never learned the truth. They did learn it, or enough of it to understand the shape of what had lived among them. They learned that the medicines had not merely healed. They learned that the long visits, the careful notes, the private questions, and the strange weakening that followed certain recoveries were not unfortunate accidents gathered around one unlucky physician. They were part of a deliberate design. What Coldwater Holler never received was the kind of ending history prefers. There was no public trial, no official confession entered into the county record, and no neat body of evidence preserved in a courthouse drawer for later generations to cite with confidence. There was only testimony, surviving ledgers, a burned practice, and a man who disappeared into the mountains before the law could put a hand on him. And that absence mattered, because history is often less a record of what happened than of what can be borne, documented, and repeated without shattering the people made to carry it. What Dr. Alistair Vail had done was too shameful for the Holler, not because the blame belonged to them, but because admitting the full truth required admitting how completely they had opened their doors to him. Mothers had handed him their feverish children. Husbands had trusted him with laboring wives. Sons and daughters had begged him to save aging parents. The preacher had spoken well of him. The strongest families had deferred to him. He had not forced his way into that community like a raider or a thief. He had entered with respectability, with education, with clean instruments and a steady voice, and that made the betrayal harder to preserve in any official form. It is one thing to record violence when it arrives snarling at the threshold. It is another thing to record what happened when everyone believed they were inviting help inside. So the story thinned, as such stories do. It retreated from formal record into family warning, church memory, and the guarded language of people who still felt, even decades later, that speaking too plainly about it might reopen something never properly closed. The burned house disappeared. The practice became a patch of ground. The names of the patients faded one by one as generations passed. But the pattern remained, carried not in textbooks or state archives, but in the unease certain descendants still felt around men whose authority rested too heavily on being unquestioned. Somewhere beneath all the altered retellings, the essential truth survived. A doctor came up the mountain, made himself indispensable, and used the helplessness of the sick as cover for something methodical and inhuman. That is what made him too evil for the history books. Not that the truth was unknown, but that it revealed something people prefer not to look at for long. That monstrous acts do not always hide behind chaos. Sometimes they hide behind order, behind credentials, behind bedside calm, and the language of care, in isolated places, especially, where need is urgent and choices are few. Authority can become its own disguise. A black medical bag on a kitchen table can mean salvation. It can also mean that the person standing beside it has been invited into the most vulnerable hour of a family's life and will not be questioned because no one can bear to risk losing what little help exists. And that may be the darkest lesson Coldwater Holler left behind. Evil does not always come stomping up the road with blood on its hands and madness in its eyes. Sometimes it arrives washed and composed. Sometimes it speaks gently. Sometimes it keeps its instruments clean, lowers its voice in the sick room, and asks to be let inside. If this story stayed with you, let me know in the comments what you think was most disturbing about Dr. Vail. And if you want more dark historical stories like this, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for the next account.